Welcome back, everyone. This is Nutrition Bio 125, and this is Dr. Jenkins. So here we are. We have covered carbohydrates, we have covered fats or lipids, and now here we are for our third macronutrient, protein. Fun little cartoon, I think. No buns, right? Haha. All right, just like we've done before, I like to do a little trivia. This will never be on an exam or a quiz. But these are things that we're going to be talking about. Is the body able to store protein? What do we do with excess protein? And then we look at some examples. Is this true or false? 2 servings of the Ultramet protein supplement shake contains more protein than an average person needs in 1 day. It might be close, folks. Here's our outline, similar to what we did before. Let's just jump right in. Hello, fried chicken. Gotta have some fun, folks. Okay. So we've talked about carbohydrates and lipids, and carbohydrates and lipids are made up of some kind of arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's it. Now that we're getting to protein, there's something unique about the structure of protein, and that is that it contains not only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but also nitrogen. So this is unique to proteins. Sure, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbs and lipids, but it is the addition of nitrogen that makes protein protein. There's a good side to this, but also a negative side. The good side to nitrogen is that it makes protein what it is and allows us to use it for the functions that we need it for. But the downside is that nitrogen makes protein a pain in the butt to work with. It makes it more difficult to break down. It makes it more difficult to deal with excess or break down products. So there's a good and a bad. Structurally, every protein, and I'm guessing a lot of you have already heard of this, every protein is made up of smaller components called amino acids. There are 20 amino acids. That's it, 20. So what's cool is that every protein is made up of these same 20 amino acids in some sort of combination. And by the way, amino gets its word because it's Latin for nitrogen containing. So some of our proteins are shorter chains, maybe 100 amino acids. Some are longer. I mean, they can be really, really long. Here is what an amino acid structure looks like. You do not have to know all these parts, folks. But what I do want to point out is nitrogen. That's what makes this a protein. So speaking of an amino acid, it does have 4 parts, technically. It has the central carbon right in the middle. It has an acid group to one side, a side chain up top, and an amine group to the other side. All I would like you to know is it is this side chain that differs between amino acids, right? That side chain is what is different. The amine group, the central carbon, and the acid group, they're kind of the same, but what makes one particular amino acid different from another is the side chain. That's all you need to know. This is what makes an amino acid different. So for example, I've just given you some examples. Glycine has this looking side chain, kind of square. Phenylalanine, that's a mouthful. Phenylalanine, let's say that again. Phenylalanine has a different shaped side chain, bigger. Aspartic acid has a little Lego, Lego looking piece. Or if you know Tetris from the OG, pardon me, So I'm just showing you pictures. I would never ask you to identify by picture what glycine looks like versus phenylalanine, but I'm just pointing out that it is the side chain that is different. Here are the 20 amino acids. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 are essential, and 11 are non-essential. Excuse me, the allergies. You do not need to know the specific names of these amino acids. However, we are going to talk about the categories. So we are going to talk about what makes something an essential amino acid versus what makes it a non-essential amino acid. And additionally, I'd like you to know that there's 9 essential and 11 non-essential. Alrighty, I am going to have to blow my nose and I apologize. I just don't want to be... Okay, so here we go. Let's start with the non-essential. What makes the non-essential amino acids special is that our body can produce them. So these 11 amino acids, pretty cool. Our cells produce them. Excuse me again, I'm so sorry. So they're considered non-essential because it is not essential that we get them from the diet. Because our body makes them for us, we don't need to get them through our diet. And this is something that's really important because this is unique to proteins. Our cells are really little protein-producing factories. That's pretty cool. They just spit out protein, these 11 non-essential amino acids. It is not the same cannot be said for carbohydrates or lipids. Our cells are not little carbohydrate-producing factories. So for carbs and lipids, we have to get everything we need from the food that we eat, but not so for protein. Just over half of the amino acids our cells make for us. Therefore, the essential amino acids are the ones that we must get through our diet. It is essential to get them through our diet because our body cannot make them. Because our body cannot make them, it is essential that we get them through our diet. I'm not sure what's happening here. Allergy attack. Okay, so know the numbers, 9 and 11, and what essential versus non-essential means. I am going to give you another definition here, but you do not have to know it. So sometimes people will use the word conditional essential amino acids. That means that under certain conditions, some of the non-essential actually cannot be made by our body without something else, but you don't need to know that. This is just an example. I'm not going to ask you about it on an exam or quiz, but there is particularly one amino acid that you may have heard of, tryptophan. Let's go back to our list. Tryptophan, here it is. This is an essential amino acid, which means that we must get it through our diet. Maybe you've heard of tryptophan. It is found in a protein like turkey. It has been said that the tryptophan is what can make you sleepy. You know, Thanksgiving Day, you eat a lot of turkey, and then you're tired. There is a link between tryptophan and a certain hormone in the brain, but it is probably the case that you're sleepy because of all the carbohydrates and just the overall food you've eaten in general, not necessarily the tryptophan. All right. So we've established that every protein is made up of these smaller building blocks called amino acids. We've established that some of the amino acids our body can make, non-essential, 11, and some our body cannot make, essential, 9, that we must get through our diet. So the last thing I want to talk about with the structure is the type of bond that joins these amino acids. Peptide, a lot of P words here, right? So if indeed, because it is true, If a protein is made up of a chain of amino acids, in this picture we have a chain of 3 amino acids, well, what's going to join them? They have to be linked together somehow. So they are joined by these particular chemical bonds called peptide bonds. You don't need to know any of the specifics, just be able to give that term, peptide bond, type of bond that joins amino acids. There are different lengths. You do not need to know these. So even though they have a star beside them, you don't have to know them. But there is indeed a dipeptide, tripeptide, polypeptide. You can guess what the definitions mean, but you don't have to know these specifics. Excuse me. All right. So we finished talking about the structure. Let's get to the functions. This whole video is going to be of me blowing my nose. I'm so sorry. Didn't really get so bad till I sat down to record this. Okay, so functions. Everyone knows that protein is important. It sure is. So let's really get into it. If you were going to look at our body weight, about 20% of it is protein. So we have a lot of it because it's so important. And protein gives function to a lot of different things. Okay, here's a listing of some of the functions. Here's a listing of more of the functions, more of the functions, more of the functions, more of the functions. This could be confusing, but you know what? I'm here to help you. So I'm going to back out for a minute, and we're going to make a new one here. Let's see, make a new document. New one of these. Okay. Look at me using technology, barely. So what I want to do is I want to summarize all these functions in an easier way. So let's summarize all the functions. And this is how I would prefer that you study, because the questions on quizzes and exams will come from how I'm going to talk about it. The number one function of protein in the body, we think about structure. And this is probably what you think of, right? We know that protein gives structure to our muscles. We have over 600 skeletal muscles. That's a lot. Plus we have cardiac muscle in our heart wall. Plus we have smooth muscle in the walls of our organs and the walls of our arteries. So I think it might be easier just to use the general umbrella term structure. Protein gives structure to muscles, but not only muscles, ligaments, tendons, bones, skin. The list goes on, my friend. Ligaments, tendons, bone, skin, hair, nails. Let's not forget the skin. That's your body's largest organ. We got a lot of skin, largest organ, made up primarily of protein. So that's going to cover a lot here. Muscles, bones, ligaments, tendons, and skin. And then we have these next things here. You know, it says hormones, enzymes, regulation, transport, antibodies. Let's summarize this, folks. A second big function of protein is that it forms chemicals in the body. So a lot of our really important chemicals, like, wait a minute, hormones and enzymes, they're actually structurally made up of proteins. So, examples of chemicals in our body that are really important that are made up of protein, enzymes. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions. We need them to live. Hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers, tell our organs and body what to do. We need those. That's what we're talking about here. But there's other chemicals too. See, it says transport, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein on the red blood cell surface that allows our red blood cells to transport oxygen. So we have to be able to have these proteins so we can transport oxygen. Look up the top, acid-base balance. So we have these things called buffers. Buffers help us to maintain the appropriate acid and base balance in our blood. And it's not just that. There's more. Antibodies. Antibodies. So we think of the body's immune system. Antibodies are made up of protein. So a lot of these really important chemicals that we rely on every day, there's even more than this, right? I'm just giving you a list of some. All of these are made up of protein. And then we can see energy, but only as the last resort. So, last resort for energy. So our cells, we know that for energy, they would rather burn carbs and fat and only burn protein as the last resort. So out of all of our energy, only about 10 to 15% of it should come from protein, which means 85 to 90% of all of our energy to our cells should come from carbs and fat, only a very small amount from protein. So I encourage you to look at the functions this way. Good stuff, right? Okay, way easier, I think, than all these things. All right. Now, it's important that when we talk about the function of protein, it's important that we talk about a term called denaturation. So if we say that a normal protein looks like this, and indeed some proteins, this kind of looks like hemoglobin, right, which is what transports oxygen on red blood cells. Some proteins look like that. Some are just linear chains, but some of them kind of fold back on each other and form these globules. So proteins need to maintain their shape. It's not surprising. If it's going to do a certain job, it's got to maintain a certain shape. Well, under certain conditions, we can have something happen called denaturation. And I like to think of this as, it says here, unfolding. I even like the word unraveling. So sometimes, and it's usually under changes in temperature or pH. So if we have a really hot body temperature or our pH gets really low, these proteins will unravel. They'll denature. And that's bad. So if the temperature is hot enough, or if the blood is acidic enough, these proteins will denature. And guess what, folks? When they denature, they can no longer do their job. So when we think about, if someone has a really low blood pH, they're going into what's called acidosis, or they're really, really hyperthermic, heat exhaustion, where their core temperature rises. What's the real danger? Well, the real danger is that because it's really hot or really acidic, these proteins will denature. The enzymes will unravel, won't be able to work. Hormones will unravel, denature, won't be able to work. So this is really why those extreme temperatures of pHs are so bad. So just know that in general, right? Proteins need their normal shape to function. Under extreme conditions, such as temperature or pH changes that are extreme, the proteins will denature and they can no longer do their job. Now, what's interesting is, let me go back to here. So this is bad news. This is bad when it occurs inside the body. So when we're talking about those important chemicals that proteins help to form, right, when we're talking about those important chemicals, this is bad. We don't want our enzymes and hormones to denature inside the body. Yet, if we're talking about cooking food outside the body, we actually like it. So when cooking food, we like it. We actually purposely want to denature the proteins in the food that we're eating. So we don't want to cook our own hormones and enzymes, folks. But if I'm cooking that steak, I purposely want to put it under a high heat. Because remember, under high heat, the proteins denature. When you're cooking a steak, what are you eating? The muscle of that animal. And you actually want the proteins in that muscle to denature because it makes the meat taste less tough. So it helps with texture, it can help with taste. Even if you talk about adding acid, so if you're making a marinade, or even if you add a lot of salt to something, adding acid can quote unquote cook something. Really, you're just denaturing the proteins to loosen the texture and improve taste. So we don't like, it's bad in our body, but when we're cooking food, we actually like it. Okay, so now that we've talked about basic structure, basic function, let's review some of the specifics about digestion and absorption with protein. Okay, so there's nothing particularly new here. So what I want to point out is what is unique about protein. One thing that is unique about protein is chemical digestion can begin in the stomach. We discussed this briefly in the chapter on the digestive system, but I'm bringing it back. We know that chemical digestion of all nutrients occurs in the small intestine, but we can start to chemically digest some protein in the stomach. The particular enzymes that we utilize in the stomach are called proteases, but you do not need to know those. When we get to absorption, which of course all of our macronutrient absorption occurs in the small intestine, when we get to absorption, something that's unique about proteins is we do absorb proteins that have been broken down into amino acids. We absorb them through the small intestine wall into the bloodstream. But what's unique is that these proteins require a carrier. So it's an added step, makes it a little bit harder for the body. So you should be reviewing and studying only the important things or the unique things that I'm pointing out. Okay, this is the same thing, just saying it in another way. Same thing, saying it in another way. Same thing, I'm just really beating a dead horse here, right? What is unique about protein digestion and absorption? It takes longer. Protein is more difficult to break down. That has that pesky nitrogen. It requires a carrier when it is absorbed through the small intestine wall into the bloodstream. And the other thing that I did add was that chemical digestion of proteins can begin in the stomach. Even though we do the most chemical digestion in the small intestine, we can begin chemical digestive protein in the stomach. We cannot chemically digest carbohydrates or fat in the stomach, only protein. Okay. Now, this can get a little tricky, but stay with me. Let me just peek ahead because I want to Okay. When we digest and absorb proteins. So this really should say after proteins are digested and absorbed. After proteins are digested and absorbed, one of two things will happen. Some of those amino acids will stay right in the bloodstream. Some of those amino acids will stay in the blood. They'll stay in the blood and will be used immediately in the blood. It might be easier to say some proteins stay in the blood. I think that's a better way of saying it, actually. So when we absorb those amino acids through the small intestine wall via a carrier into the blood, well, some of those proteins, they stay in the blood. They may go to cells to be utilized for energy, a small amount, but that's true for some. Some amino acids will be used to make other stuff. Sometimes I try and really break it down and make it as easy to understand as possible, used to make other stuff. We can take protein and make glucose, right? Apparently I'm having a hard time talking today. We can make new gluconeogenesis. I couldn't get the word out. So after we digest and absorb proteins, one option, and this is a less common path, some of those proteins will stay in the blood. Either they'll be used by the cells for energy in a small amount, or they'll be used to make other stuff. The more common path is that instead of those proteins just staying in the blood and circulating through the body, maybe I should say that. Number one, proteins stay in the blood and circulate through the body. Some of those proteins will stay in the blood and circulate through the body. Well, more commonly, those proteins go to the liver. So they're in the bloodstream for a little bit, but they go right to the liver instead of circulating throughout the body. When proteins go to the liver, some of them form what's called an amino acid pool. Some of them are recycled or reused. And this is the more common path. So it's more complicated. You know, with fats and carbs, it was kind of simpler. They're absorbed, they go to the liver. The liver will keep some in the bloodstream and store the rest. But I'm about to give you one of the answers at the beginning. We cannot store protein. You know, we store fat as adipose tissue. We've got adipose tissue everywhere in our body, under our skin, around our organs, so we can store almost endless amounts of fat. We can store glucose in the skeletal muscles and in the liver. We store it as glycogen, and we can store plenty of glycogen, but we cannot store protein. So where it goes after it's absorbed, it's a little more complicated. A small amount of those recently absorbed amino acids will stay in the blood, circulate through the body, used for energy from the cells to a small amount, and some of them will be used to make other stuff. Most of the time, recently absorbed amino acids go to the liver. And the liver, because it can't store protein, really, it forms these little amino acid pools. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, but an amino acid pool is like a small bundle. They use the word amino acid pool because just imagine, you know, the amino acids like hanging out together. So I guess they're using the word pool as another word for collection, but it's a small collection. Small bundle, small collection. And that's what's going to happen to a lot of these amino acids. They go to the liver, and then the liver can't store them, but it forms them into these small little bundles or collections called amino acid pools. And then other amino acids that go to the liver will be recycled or reused. Good. So this is number one, proteins that stay in the blood and circulate throughout the body. Some are used as energy, some are used to make new stuff. Remember, we don't want to use too much protein for energy. Our cells are designed to burn primarily carbs and fats and a small amount for protein. If your body's in a situation where it has to burn more protein, well, taking more protein for energy takes away protein from some of its other functions, and that's not good. And then the majority of proteins, they go to the liver, and we cannot store protein in large amounts. So we store them in small amounts in these little collections or small bundles. They happen to use the term amino acid pool. But just imagine, like I wrote down before, a little amino acid collection. And here they're showing you what an amino acid pool would look like. A little bundle. These bundles hang out throughout the body. So some of these bundles circulate the bloodstream. Some of them are inside the cells. So these bundles do travel throughout our body. And this is what our body uses as its constant protein source. There's a really small amount of protein that circulates on its own to be used for energy. Most of the protein that we use for whatever, for energy, to form muscle structure, to form the skin, to form chemicals, most of the proteins that we use for that are taken out of the bloodstream from these pools. So an organ, let's say it's a muscle will reach out and say, hey, I need these amino acids, and take it to the muscle. And then, as this amino acid pool travels back throughout the body, back to the liver, hopefully there'll be some more amino acids that have just come in or are recently there, and we'll resupply. We'll refill the amino acid pool. The process that I just talked about is called protein turnover. So we have these amino acid pools. Let's say that an average amino acid pool, and I'm going to say less just because for ease of me writing this down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say that this amino acid pool has 5 amino acids. Of course, it's going to have more, but I'm just making a point. Well, remember I said we have a muscle over here. And that muscle needs to rebuild some of itself. So it goes to the amino acid pool nearby, and it takes 3 of them. So we're left with only 2 amino acids. So whether the amino acids are used by an organ or they're old and broken down, we have to replenish with new. This is the process of protein turnover. Whatever protein is broken down or used, we have to replenish. So it's a continuous process. Breaking down old amino acids or amino acids that have been used by organs, and then forming new amino acids into its place. Whether that amino acid comes from the diet, or whether our cells, because our cells can make protein for us, or whether it's that our cells produce some amino acids. All right. This is looking through that process. Okay. So here we go, folks. We cannot store amino acids in large amounts. We are unable to store large amounts of protein. Can't do it, folks. Think about this also. We're able to produce a lot of amino acids. So based on these 2 things, especially considering here in the United States, protein is a big part of every meal. If you think about, you go out to eat, what's the biggest thing on the plate? Usually it's the protein. Now we may recall from I believe it was chapter 2, we talked about the My Plate guidelines. Ideally, half of the plate should be fruits and vegetables, but it's usually not. So we're ingesting a lot of protein. We don't need as much protein through our diet. Why? Because our body makes some of the protein for us. So here we have a situation where we're bringing in a lot more protein than we need. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of people. And I'm not a protein hater. Sometimes people say, Dr. Jenkins, why do you hate protein? I don't hate protein. It's really important. But I want to educate people that we need to match our protein intake with what our body actually needs. Because our body produces a lot of amino acids for us, we don't need as much protein through diet to meet our needs. If we do bring in more protein than we need, we can't store it in large amounts. So what is our body going to do with it? Well, protein is a pain in the butt to break down because of that pesky nitrogen. We can't store very much of it. It's hard to break down. So at the end of the day, if someone brings in more protein than they need, more protein than they can store, more protein than they can keep up with getting rid of, your body has no choice but to store the excess as fat. True story. So, you think about your weekend warrior, goes and lifts weights at the gym, thinks, well, because I lift weight, I need more protein. Doesn't realize that they're probably bringing in too much protein already. They take a protein supplement. They think they're doing the right thing, but in fact, they are bringing in too much protein for their body to handle, and the body will store the excess as fat. Now, it is true, athletes need a little bit more protein than non-athletes, but it's not that hard to get our protein needs, and it's pretty easy to bring in too much. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here. We're going to come back for the second half of the video. I'll see you soon in part 2.